The Amazon rainforest may not be a pristine wilderness at all, but the overgrown graveyard of a lost urban world spread across 10,000 square kilometers of jungle. And that simple shift in perspective changes everything about how we see history, ecology, and ourselves. For decades, explorers, missionaries, and even most scientists looked at the endless green canopy and concluded that the forest was too poor in nutrients, too wet, too hostile to ever sustain large, complex societies. At best, only small, scattered tribes could survive there. Yet when aircraft equipped with LIDAR began sweeping across the basin and the 2024 survey data were processed, an invisible layer of the Amazon suddenly came into focus. Straight roads where no path is visible on the ground, rectilinear platforms and plazas hidden under towering trees, earthen mounds aligned along ceremonial axes, and canal systems etched into the soil like the veins of a long-dead giant. It is as if someone switched on an X-ray machine over the world's largest tropical forest and revealed, beneath the leaves, the faint but undeniable geometry of a vanished civilization. To grasp why this is so shocking, imagine flying over the Amazon the way pilots have done for a century. Below you, just an unbroken carpet of green, a living ocean of foliage stretching to the horizon in every direction, occasionally interrupted by a river that meanders like a brown serpent through the trees. From that vantage point, it is almost impossible to believe that there could be cities down there, no stone pyramids breaking the canopy, no monumental walls, no colonnades or towers. Now overlay the LIDAR data. The vegetation is digitally stripped away, and a second landscape emerges on the same ground, a mesh of perfectly straight lines running for tens of kilometers, forming crossroads and grids. Clusters of raised platforms, some square, some circular, connected by processional avenues. Massive embankments and ditches outlining what look like causeways, reservoirs, and defensive works. In some regions, the density of these features is so high that if you saw only the bare earth model, you might think you were looking at the outskirts of a modern city, minus the skyscrapers and asphalt. The 10,000 square kilometer figure is not a poetic exaggeration, but a scale that demands a different category of thinking. 10,000 square kilometers is roughly 6 times the size of Greater London, or about the land area of a small European country. It is far too large to dismiss as a curious cluster of villages. When archaeologists translate that area into plausible population densities, say 100 to 200 people per square kilometer, conservative figures for pre-industrial farming societies, they arrive at numbers in the range of hundreds of thousands to several million inhabitants during the pre-Columbian peak. That means that, at some point before European contact, the central and southern Amazon may have been as densely peopled and as heavily engineered as many parts of Europe or Asia. The forest we see today would then be, at least in part, a post-collapse ecosystem, a regrown mantle of vegetation covering the footprints of a sophisticated urban agrarian mosaic. The key to uncovering this hidden world is the strange, almost magical way LIDAR turns forest into data. From a plane or helicopter flying a few hundred meters above the canopy, an instrument fires hundreds of thousands of laser pulses per second toward the ground, measuring how long each pulse takes to bounce back. Most pulses hit leaves and branches, but a fraction slip through gaps and reach the soil, tree roots, and ancient earthworks below. By recording millions of these returns and their precise positions, computers can construct an insanely detailed, three-dimensional model of everything, in the scanned swath from the top of the tallest emergent tree right down to the subtle undulations of the forest floor. Then, with a few lines of code, analysts strip away the points corresponding to vegetation, leaving a bare earth model so clean that even a 30-centimeter high terrace or a half-eroded ditch becomes visible. Features that no human could ever map reliably while hacking through undergrowth suddenly appear as crisp lines and shapes on a screen. When those bare earth models from different survey flights were stitched together in 2024, what emerged was not a random scattering of oddities, but coherent urban landscapes. You see trunk roads raised, straight embankments 7 to 20 meters wide, radiating from major centers like the spokes of a wheel, connecting outlying settlements and agricultural zones. You see complexes where dozens or hundreds of mounds are organized into plazas and corridors, some oriented toward solstice sunrises or key stars, hinting at ceremonial and cosmological planning. You see gridded field systems, fish ponds, and canal networks designed to manage the extreme seasonality of Amazonian rainfall, mitigating floods in the wet season and conserving water in the dry. In these images, the stereotype of the Amazon as a chaotic green hell gives way to a new vision, a domesticated landscape, tuned and shaped by human minds over centuries or millennia, then abruptly abandoned. Equally unsettling is the way this new evidence forces us to reinterpret encounters recorded by early European explorers. Chroniclers from the 16th and 17th centuries occasionally described stretches of the Amazon with surprisingly large and prosperous riverside towns, dense populations, and extensive gardens, only for later visitors in the 18th and 19th centuries to find the same stretches apparently empty, with only scattered villages and no trace of urban life. For a long time, historians dismissed the early accounts as exaggerations or misunderstandings, preferring the safer narrative that real civilization had never taken root in the rainforest. Now, with LIDAR showing that cities and engineered landscapes did exist far from the riverbanks, the older reports suddenly look less like fantasy and more like brief, tragic snapshots taken just before epidemic disease and colonial disruption overturned an entire world. Between the first wave of contact and the time modern science arrived, the forest had time to reclaim roads, plazas, and houses built mainly of earth and wood, leaving behind only earthworks and soil signatures that nobody knew how to see. The opening question then practically asks itself, if the Amazon's primeval forest sits on the ruins of a forgotten 10,000 square kilometer urban network, what else are we wrong about when we draw the line between wilderness and civilization? This is not just a story about one lost city or even a cluster of lost cities. It is a story about how an entire discipline, archaeology, and really an entire global culture underestimated both the scale of human transformation of tropical landscapes and the speed with which nature can erase the most ambitious human projects when populations collapse. LIDAR has turned the Amazon into a kind of time-lapse experiment, showing us a before and after with the middle missing. Once, complex societies dense enough to reshape soils, forests, and waterways. Now, what looks like untouched jungle, but is, in fact, second growth over deep cultural strata. For a documentary, this opening is not just about presenting a cool technology and a big number. It is about inviting the viewer into a reversal of intuition. The forest that seemed eternal may be recent. The emptiness that seemed primordial may be the aftermath of catastrophe. The people long framed as marginal forest tribes may be the fragmented descendants of urban populations, whose engineers, planners, and farmers once managed a landscape as intensively as any in the ancient world. As the camera moves from the hypnotic sea of green to the ghostly wireframe of LIDAR-revealed cities, the audience is not just witnessing the revelation of a lost world they are seeing. In real time, our own story about the Amazon crack open, making room for a new, more unsettling question. If an entire 10,000 square kilometer civilization could disappear so completely that we only rediscovered it with lasers from the sky, how fragile might our own cities look from the vantage point of some future sensor, scanning the ruins of a world that also thought itself permanent? What makes this revelation even more powerful is that it depends entirely on a way of seeing the forest that no human eye can achieve unaided. The X-ray images of buried Amazonian landscapes do not come from intuition, from local legends, or from chance discoveries of ruins while cutting a road. They come from instruments bolted under airplane wings, firing invisible pulses of light toward the canopy thousands of times per second and timing their return with nanosecond precision. This is where the story naturally pivots from shock at what has been found to fascination, with how it was found. The leap from staring at an unbroken sea of trees and guessing to scanning entire regions with laser vision and measuring. The same forest that hid everything from conquistadors, missionaries, rubber barons, and even modern biologists becomes transparent to an instrument that cares nothing about vines, leaves, or clouds of insects. It only cares about distances. Once you understand what that instrument is doing, the idea that a 10,000 square kilometer urban footprint might have gone unnoticed for centuries stops sounding impossible and starts sounding inevitable. At its core, LIDAR light detection and ranging is brutally simple in concept. Send out a pulse of laser light, wait for the reflection, and measure how long it took to come back. Multiply that time by the speed of light, divide by 2, and you get the distance to whatever the pulse hit. Now imagine doing that not once, but hundreds of thousands of times every second from a carefully surveyed flight path, while knowing exactly where your aircraft is and how it is oriented in three-dimensional space. What you accumulate is not a photograph in the traditional sense, but a point cloud, a dense swarm of dots in 3D, each dot marking a precise point on a leaf, branch, trunk, roof, or patch of soil. One short flight over a few dozen square kilometers of forest can generate billions of such points, a raw digital fog that, at first glance, looks like static. The magic comes later when algorithms begin to sort, filter, and classify those points, separating the top of the world, the tree crowns, from the bottom of the world, the forest floor, and whatever human-made features it holds. In a typical Amazonian survey, most LIDAR pulses hit vegetation. The canopy is thick, sometimes closing almost completely, and below it hangs an understory of vines, epiphytes, branches, and small trees that scatter light in every direction. But a fraction of pulses, only a few percent, thread their way through tiny gaps and finally reach the ground or the tops of ancient earthworks. Because the instrument records multiple returns for each pulse, first from upper leaves, then from lower layers, then from the soil, you can later sort returns by height. Strip away the highest returns and you see just the canopy. Strip away everything above a certain threshold and you are left with just the lowest layer, the bare earth model. On that model, things that were invisible in the chaos of real forest suddenly stand out with almost rude clarity. A terrace edge, a linear embankment, a rectilinear platform a meter high but 50 meters long, a circular ditch that had been smoothed by centuries of erosion, yet still cuts a 30-centimeter groove in the ground. The 2024 campaigns over key Amazonian regions pushed this approach to new extremes, both in coverage and in processing. Instead of mapping a few isolated sites, teams targeted continuous blocks of landscape, hundreds or thousands of square kilometers at a time, flying parallel transects until they had acquired overlapping swaths of point clouds that could be stitched together into seamless mosaics. Advances in onboard GPS and inertial measurement systems reduced positional errors to decimeter scales, meaning that features lined up almost perfectly from flight to flight. On the ground, really, in labs and data centers thousands of kilometers away, new generations of software took over, automatically classifying ground points, generating digital terrain models at resolutions of half a meter or even finer, and then running pattern recognition routines to flag anomalies. Straight lines, where natural processes rarely produce them. Right angles, repeated shapes, radial patterns. From the storyteller's perspective, this is where the imagery from Part 1 becomes three-dimensional and technical without losing its sense of wonder. That specter of lost cities under the trees is no longer just an evocative metaphor. You can literally rotate the bare earth model on screen, tilt it, drape it with color gradients showing elevation, and watch how what once appeared as flat floodplain transforms into a sculpted cultural landscape. You can follow a causeway as it rises ever so slightly above surrounding ground. Trace its path as it crosses low areas via embankments and skirts higher ground along contour lines, and see how it links one mound cluster to another, then to a canal system, then to what appears to be a central plaza. It becomes natural to talk about road networks, neighborhoods, ceremonial centers. Because the spatial logic is the same sort of logic that underpins any city. Efficient movement, focal points of power and ritual, zones of production and storage. One of the most striking aspects of the Amazonian LIDAR data is how it collapses the old distinction between site and non-site. In traditional archaeology, you have dots on a map. This mound here, that village there, and a whole lot of empty space between them, where nobody assumes much was happening. LIDAR replaces that with continuous surfaces. You see that what had been mapped as a single site is actually just the most obvious knot in a dense web of smaller features that extend in all directions, a scatter of minor platforms, field ridges, drainage ditches, fish ponds, and minor paths that knit the landscape together. Conversely, areas once thought empty reveal faint but regular patterning. Low, parallel ridges suggesting garden plots, small rectilinear terraces stepping up a slope, a cluster of barely raised rectangles that almost certainly once supported houses. The 10,000 square kilometers of interest are not a single megalopolis in the modern sense, but a tiled mosaic of many centers and their hinterlands, an urban-rural continuum rather than isolated islands. At the human scale, the power of this technology lies in what it implies about past choices. Nobody accidentally builds a straight embankment 10 kilometers long through swampy forest. Nobody casually aligns a series of mounds along a cardinal axis that happens to mark solstice sunrise. Such features take planning, surplus labor, and a shared vision of how the landscape should be structured. When LIDAR shows them replicated over and over a grid of roads here, a ring of ditches there, a repeating module of plaza plus mounds elsewhere, it becomes almost impossible to maintain the old assumption that Amazonian societies were simple or small scale. The geometry is the smoking gun. Forests left to themselves do not draw straight lines. People do. The tech, cold and impersonal as it is, ends up serving as the most eloquent witness for the intentionality of long-vanished communities. There is also a temporal dimension hidden in the data, one that later parts of the documentary can develop, but which is worth hinting at early. Because each LIDAR survey captures the current state of erosion and sedimentation, and because archaeologists can sometimes tie particular feature types to pottery styles or radiocarbon dates from small ground truth excavations, the models become more than static snapshots. They become the basis for reconstructing sequences. A canal that slices through an older mound, a younger road that skirts an earlier earthwork, a terrace built over the infilled remains of a ditch. These relationships can be read off the terrain model, like layers in a CT scan. The 2024 data, in other words, are not just telling us that there was a city-like world under the trees. They are starting to tell us how that world grew, was reorganized, and eventually unraveled. By the end of this second movement in your narrative, the viewer should feel that they have stepped through the looking glass. What had been a uniform green blur now resolves into a structured environment, revealed only to instruments and algorithms, and the dry term remote sensing starts to sound more like remote time travel. We are no longer speculating in the abstract about whether maybe there were more people in the Amazon than we thought. We are looking at their handiwork in measurable detail, thanks to beams of light fired from aircraft decades after the forest swallowed their walls and streets. The stage is now set to move from how we see to what we see to zoom in the next section on those roads, canals, and mounds themselves, and to ask what kind of civilization would have needed to build, maintain, and ultimately abandon an engineered landscape that once spanned 10,000 square kilometers of what we were all taught to call untouched jungle. What the LIDAR data reveals, once you strip away the novelty of the technology and look at the patterns themselves, is not just that something is there under the trees, but that the something has all the hallmarks of deliberate, large-scale urban design rather than scattered, opportunistic camps. That is where the story has to turn next. From marveling at laser scans to asking what kind of world those lines and shapes represent. For centuries, the dominant narrative said the Amazon was too poor to support dense populations, that thin tropical soils and brutal humidity made intensive agriculture impossible, and therefore precluded city-scale societies. The bare earth models tell a different story. They show a landscape crisscrossed by engineered causeways, bounded by embankments, punctuated by platforms and plazas, and stitched together by hydraulic works, exactly the sort of infrastructure you would expect if large communities were not only living in the forest, but actively reorganizing it according to shared plans and needs. One of the clearest visual shocks comes from the roads. In natural environments, especially in floodplains and lowland rainforest, lines tend to meander. Rivers snake, animal paths weave, treefall gaps form irregular patches. Yet in the LIDAR-derived terrain models of key Amazonian regions, you see features that refuse to bend except at sharp, intentional angles. Straight embankments, several meters wide, running like taut strings across gently rolling ground for 10, 20, sometimes more kilometers before meeting other lines at T-junctions or crossroads. In some sectors, these linear features form lattices grids, where parallel causeways are linked by perpendicular connectors, carving the forest floor into long rectangles. At their intersections sit clusters of mounds and depressions that read like nodal points, maybe village centers, maybe market squares, maybe ceremonial complexes. Whatever their precise function, the geometry itself is evidence of coordination. You don't get right angles and long-distance straight lines by accident in a swampy forest. You get them by design. Just as striking are the clusters of raised platforms and mounds that anchor these networks. The LIDAR images show them as low, bright shapes against darker surroundings. Square and rectangular embankments, some only a few decimeters high today, but originally likely taller, arranged around open courtyards. Elongated stair-like terraces stepping up gentle slopes. Circular or oval platforms forming rings or arcs. In several documented complexes, dozens of these features group together along a central axis, with the largest mounds at the core and smaller ones radiating outwards, reminiscent of the ceremonial precincts of Andean or Mesoamerican sites, albeit built in earth rather than stone. Their sizes range from modest 20 or 30 meters across to monumental by local standards, 100 meters or more on a side. Imagining them not as flat shapes on a screen, but as once elevated platforms carrying wooden temples, council houses, or elite dwellings immediately sharpens the sense that we are looking at the footprints of an organized hierarchical society. The third major category of structures that emerges from the LIDAR scans concerns water. In lowland Amazonia, too much water is as much a problem as too little. Rains can turn vast areas into seasonal wetlands, and river levels can rise and fall dramatically over the course of a year. The bare earth models reveal that past inhabitants did not simply endure these cycles, they engineered around them. You can see sinuous, shallow channels cut parallel to modern streams, the remnants of ancient canals used to divert floodwaters or feed fish ponds. Rectangular basins, surrounded by low dikes, dot the terrain in some regions, their flat bottoms suggesting controlled filling and draining. In slightly higher areas, parallel ridges and furrows, each only a meter or two wide but stretching for hundreds of meters, mark out raised field agriculture systems designed to keep crops above saturated ground while retaining moisture during dry spells. Taken together, these features map a sophisticated water management system that could smooth out the extremes of the Amazon's hydrological pulse, supporting reliable food production for large populations. When you lay these elements over one another, roads, platforms, canals, fields, the picture begins to resemble something urban in the functional sense, even if it doesn't match our stone and steel mental image of a city. There are clear centers where multiple roads converge, where the largest mounds cluster, where hydraulic structures are densest. Around these hubs lies a halo of smaller platforms and residential-scale features, which thin out with distance before giving way to more purely agricultural patterns. Beyond that, yet another ring appears: forest regrowth, secondary vegetation, and perhaps the edges of territories once controlled by rival groups. In this configuration, the oft-quoted 10,000 square kilometers are not a single contiguous mass of buildings, but a tightly integrated urban-rural matrix, dozens or hundreds of population nodes, each with its own fields and ponds, bound together by infrastructure and, presumably, by social, political, and religious ties. It feels less like stumbling on an isolated ruin and more like realizing that an entire regional system has been hiding in plain sight under the trees. This realization forces a rethinking of what empty forest really means. From the vantage point of someone paddling a canoe along a river in the 18th or 19th century, the banks might appear sparsely populated, with only occasional hamlets visible through the greenery. That observer could easily conclude that the interior was similar or even emptier. But the LIDAR data suggest a more complicated pattern. Populations and constructions heavily concentrated slightly away from the main channels, perhaps to avoid flooding and raiding, linked by overland causeways and minor waterways that did not align with the routes chosen by later explorers. In other words, the most intensively occupied zones might have been precisely those least visible to outsiders sticking to the big rivers. What looked like untouched wilderness to colonial eyes could, a few centuries earlier, have been a patchwork of managed forests, orchards, gardens, and settlements shaped so thoroughly by human hands that even soil composition through terra preta and other modifications bore the imprint of deliberate design. The sheer consistency of the patterns across different survey blocks also argues strongly against the idea that we are looking at a local anomaly. LIDAR campaigns over parts of Bolivia, Brazil, and adjacent countries keep turning up variations on the same themes: geoglyphs and enclosure systems in one area, mound and plaza complexes in another, road and canal networks in a third, all built to broadly similar scales and often sharing orientations or modular layouts. This suggests not a single, isolated culture experimenting on its own, but a larger cultural tradition or family of traditions, spreading ideas and techniques across hundreds or thousands of kilometers. In this light, the 10,000 square kilometer complex you frame as your documentary's main stage is both a unique case study and a window into something larger, a civilization zone that may have rivaled better-known ancient cultural areas in Mesoamerica or the Andes in both size and sophistication. Crucially, none of this implies that the forest was somehow less natural or that these societies simply paved over everything. One of the most intriguing implications of the LIDAR-revealed landscape is that it appears to be an example of co-evolution, people reshaping ecosystems while also working within their constraints rather than against them. The roads are raised, but they do not carve straight up and down steep slopes. They meander just enough to follow ridge lines and avoid flood basins. The fields sit where hydrology makes sense, often in zones that alternate between wet and dry in ways that can be harnessed rather than fought. Scattered trees and forest islands show up around earthworks in patterns that suggest intentional preservation or planting, not total clearance. If you think of a modern city as an attempt to impose a rigid grid onto indifferent terrain, this Amazonian urbanism looks more like an elaborate collaboration between human intent and environmental rhythms. By the time the viewer reaches the end of this third movement, the contrast with the textbook picture of Amazonia should be stark. Instead of a thin green line of hunters and gatherers eking out a living at the mercy of an overwhelming jungle, we see evidence for dense, organized landscape engineering societies capable of planning across kilometers, managing water, and coordinating labor on a massive scale. The forest is no longer the stage on which a few marginal players act. It is a co-author in a long, complex story of human habitation, transformation, collapse, and regrowth. And hanging over all of it is the unsettling thought that this entire system was so effectively swallowed by time and vegetation that only in the 21st century, with laser eyes and algorithms, are we beginning to grasp its true extent. That sets up the next step in your narrative, moving from patterns on a screen to the human element who these people were, how they lived in this engineered forest, and what could possibly have happened to make their 10,000 square kilometer world vanish so completely that until LIDAR, we mistook its ruins for untouched nature. From here, the most compelling way to deepen the story is to zoom in. Not just that there were roads and platforms under the forest, but what kind of everyday world they stitched together, what it meant to live in a landscape that was neither wild jungle nor stone metropolis, but something in between. If the previous section pulled the camera high enough to see the 10,000 square kilometer pattern, this one needs to drop back down, still using the LIDAR God's eye view as a guide, but now imagining feet on those causeways, eyes looking up at earthen pyramids, hands working the soil of engineered fields. The crucial pivot is this. Once you accept that the geometry is real and widespread, you no longer have the luxury of treating these earthworks as curiosities. They have to be read as infrastructure, as the physical skeleton of a civilization that lived by manipulating water, soil, and elevation with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Start with the causeways, because they are the arteries of this buried world. In the terrain models, they appear as elongated ridges, often only a meter or so higher than the surrounding floodplain, but consistently wider, straighter, and more continuous than natural levees. Picture them in use. In the rainy season, when the rivers spilled over and low points became temporary lakes, these raised paths would have been the only reliable dry routes between hamlets and central plazas. In the dry season, they would have functioned as well-drained thoroughfares for foot traffic and perhaps for carrying goods in baskets or on simple sleds. The fact that some of these causeways run in nearly straight lines for 10 or 20 kilometers suggests not just symbolic statements of control over space, but very practical investments in mobility. A straight line is the shortest path. In a world without wheeled vehicles, shaving distance and avoiding detours through swamp or tangle could mean the difference between reaching a ceremonial gathering on time and being trapped by a rising river. Branching off these causeways, often at regular intervals, are smaller embankments and trackways that lead to clusters of mounds and platforms. Here, the LIDAR Data-S dry outlines invite a more human reconstruction. Imagine entering one of these nodes after a long walk along the causeway. The ground firms up under your feet as you move from natural floodplain onto slightly raised terraces. Ahead, a broad, flattened area opens an open plaza, cleared of trees in its day, now invisible under canopy, but etched into the soil. Around its edges rise low but sharply defined platforms, some rectilinear, some circular, each large enough to hold a substantial wooden structure. In many complexes, one platform is markedly larger or more centrally placed than the others, suggesting a principal building, perhaps a council house, a shrine, or the residence of a lineage or ritual leader, while secondary platforms may have supported houses of allied families, storage buildings, or lesser ritual spaces. The arrangement itself hints at social order, not random huts scattered through the forest, but a planned ensemble where architecture encodes hierarchy and function. Beyond the central nodes lie the working landscapes that made such nodes possible. In the LIDAR-derived bare earth models, these appear as faint but regular textures on the ground, parallel ridges separated by shallow troughs, small rectangular plots bounded by low banks, networks of microchannels feeding into larger drains. These are the signatures of raised field agriculture, an ingenious response to a climate where too much rain and too much standing water can be as deadly to crops as drought. By piling soil into long, narrow ridges and digging intervening canals, farmers could keep root zones above waterlogged ground during the wettest months, while still drawing moisture from the adjacent saturated soil during dry spells. The canals themselves could host fish, snails, and aquatic plants, turning what might otherwise be a problem excess water into a second harvest. In effect, each agricultural unit became a multi-layered production system: crops on the ridges, aquatic resources in the canals, trees and palms at the edges, all integrated into one managed mosaic. The most dramatic expressions of this earth-moving mentality are the mound complexes that verge on being earthen pyramids. In several surveyed regions, LIDAR has revealed monumental platforms with bases 100 meters or more across, often with stepped profiles suggesting terracing. Their heights, worn down by centuries of erosion, might be only a few meters now, but reconstructions based on slope and volume imply original elevations easily double that. Clusters of such mounds aligned along a central axis evoke the processional avenues and ceremonial ensembles of other ancient cultures, even if their building material is compacted soil rather than cut stone. Standing on one of these in its prime, you might have looked out over an open plaza surrounded by lesser platforms, beyond which radiated the forest garden matrix of orchards, fields, and waterworks. A vantage point from which religious specialists or chiefs could literally see, and be seen by, the people whose labor sustained the entire arrangement. The LIDAR data also hint at how these communities negotiated risk in an environment prone to extremes. In some areas, clusters of houses and ceremonial structures are clearly sited on slight rises or artificial terraces just above the highest modeled flood levels, while storage mounds and key causeway junctions sit on the most elevated points available. Canals seem to be designed not just for supplying fields, but for shunting away excess water when rivers overspilled. Certain rectilinear basins and embanked enclosures may even have functioned as emergency reservoirs, capturing floodwaters that could later be tapped when rains failed. This suggests a population intimately attuned to hydrological rhythms, people who did not see floods and droughts as purely capricious whims of nature, but as recurring cycles that could be smoothed, harnessed, and partially tamed through engineering. Seen against this backdrop, the old argument that the Amazon's soils are too poor to support large populations starts to look like a half-truth that has been weaponized into a myth. It is accurate that much of the region's natural soils are heavily leached and low in nutrients. Cut down the forest, crop the land for a few years, and yields crash. But what the combination of LIDAR, soil science, and archaeology is now making clear is that ancient Amazonians did not simply accept those limitations, they altered them. The same regions that show dense networks of earthworks often coincide with patches of terra preta, dark, anthropogenic soils enriched with charred organic matter, bone, and household waste. These engineered soils can retain nutrients for centuries, effectively locking in fertility in permanent, intensively managed gardens. In other words, the earthworks mapped by LIDAR are only half the story. Below them, in the microstructure of the soil itself, lives the other half, a record of deliberate ecosystem redesign. The emerging picture is of a forest that was not simply a passive backdrop to human life, but a co-created environment. Instead of imagining a sharp boundary between city and nature, it may be more accurate to think in terms of forest cities and gardens as infrastructure. The plazas and platforms were clearings, but they were embedded in a matrix of fruit trees, medicinal plants, and successional growth that provided food, materials, and microclimates. The raised fields and canals provided not only calories, but also habitat for fish and amphibians. The causeways doubled as levees, shaping water flow while enabling movement. From a distance, especially after population collapse and regrowth of canopy, that entire mosaic can read as jungle. Close up, and with the aid of LIDAR, it reads as a designed system in which human and non-human processes were entwined. By framing this part of the documentary around the physicality of that design, the height of the mounds, the width of the causeways, the density of the fields, you give viewers concrete anchors for their imagination. Numbers like 10,000 square kilometers and alignments over tens of kilometers stop being abstract statistics and start becoming tangible, lived space. The Amazonian cities hidden under the trees were not urban in the Roman or Mayan sense of stone monuments towering over crowds, but they were urban in the sense that matters most for your overarching theme. They were dense, planned, infrastructural societies that reshaped their environment at scale. And that recognition naturally raises the next, more unsettling question your series will have to confront. If such a system was so robust, so finely tuned to its surroundings, what combination of shocks, disease, conquest, ecological feedbacks could have been powerful enough to erase it so thoroughly that for centuries we mistook its remains for untouched rainforest? The question that now looms over this engineered forest is brutally simple. How do you keep something like this going, year after year, without exhausting the very life that makes it possible? The ancient inhabitants of the Amazon answered that question not just with roads and mounds, but with the one technology that never shows up in monument lists, yet quietly underpins every complex society: soil. If LIDAR gives us the skeletal structure of a 10,000 square kilometer urban agrarian system, then the dark, human-made earth known as terra preta is its bloodstream and digestive tract, the invisible infrastructure that turned poor tropical soils into long-term engines of productivity. To understand how millions of people might once have lived in what we routinely call nutrient-poor rainforest, you have to get your hands dirty, literally, in the black earth that should not exist under natural conditions, yet persists for centuries, where people deliberately made it. Terra preta, dark earth. Doesn't look dramatic in a scan. It looks like any other patch of ground. But in a soil pit, it is impossible to mistake. A thick, charcoal-flecked layer ranging from 0.5 meter to 2 meters deep, sitting atop the orange or yellow subsoil that dominates most of the basin. Mixed into that dark matrix are tiny bits of pottery, bone fragments, charred seeds, and other micro-debris of daily life. Chemical analysis shows these black soils holding far more nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic carbon than surrounding natural soils, and, more importantly, holding on to those nutrients instead of letting them wash away in the Amazon's intense rains. The charcoal particles, what modern agronomy calls biochar, act like microscopic sponges and scaffolds, locking in minerals and hosting beneficial microbes. The result is a man-made soil that can stay fertile for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, even if it is continuously cultivated. Where you find extensive terra preta, you are almost certainly standing in the footprint of long-term, dense occupation. What makes this so crucial for your story is that the densest clusters of earthworks revealed by LIDAR tend to coincide with patches of these anthropogenic dark earths. That correlation is a smoking gun. It suggests that the same populations who built causeways, platforms, and canals were also deliberately rewiring the soil to break out of the local fertility trap. Instead of slashing and burning a patch of forest, cropping it for a few years, then moving on when yields crashed a pattern that keeps populations small and mobile, they were investing in place. By systematically adding char, kitchen scraps, human and animal waste, and plant residues to specific plots year after year, they were creating permanent, high-yield garden soils that could support intensive cultivation of staples and tree crops right next to residential and ceremonial centers. In effect, they were converting a system that punishes staying put into one that rewards it, and the 10,000 square kilometer urban footprint only makes sense against that backdrop. This opens the door to imagining not just the shape of their cities, but the tempo of their lives. In a world built on terra preta and raised fields, the ringing rhythms are agricultural and aquatic, not just architectural. In the wet season, canals brim and fish ponds fill. Causeways become bustling elevated streets as people move between slightly flooded fields, harvesting aquatic resources while tending crops on the ridges. In the dry season, water retreats into managed channels and reservoirs. Fields crack slightly on top but draw on moisture from below. Gardens continue producing fruits, tubers, and seeds from root zones anchored in those dark, nutrient-laden soils. Around mounded plazas, home gardens overflow with peppers, cassava, maize, fruit trees, medicinal plants. A three-dimensional mosaic of edible and useful species that looks from above like forest, but at the ground level functions as a precisely tuned agro-ecosystem. At this point, a striking parallel emerges between the Amazonian case and other great centers of ancient urbanism, not in their monuments, but in their invisible infrastructures. The Maya built reservoirs and terraced slopes to capture seasonal rain in karst landscapes. Andean civilizations carved canal-fed terraces into mountainsides. Mesopotamian cities laced the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates with irrigation ditches. Here, in the heart of South America, we see another variant of the same pattern. a society whose real genius lay not in a single wonder, but in 1,000, mostly modest interventions in water and soil that, taken together, allowed cities to appear where, on paper, no city could stand. The difference is that in Amazonia, those interventions were performed with earth, plants, and fire, rather than with stone and bronze materials that rot, regrow, or burn away, leaving behind only subtle landforms and microscopic char that our instruments are just now learning to read. That matters for the emotional arc of your documentary, because it makes the disappearance of this world both more understandable and more haunting. When a stone civilization collapses, it leaves behind skeletons of temples and fortifications that shout their existence across millennia. When an earthen and forest civilization collapses, especially one embedded in a hyper-productive climate like the Amazon-S, its traces vanish into the churn of growth and decay with astonishing speed. Houses made of wood and palm thatch can be gone within a few decades. Gardens, if untended, are overwhelmed by secondary growth that from a distance looks indistinguishable from wild jungle. Raised fields soften under rain and flood until they are just gentle undulations. Terra preta persists, but only as a soil horizon, invisible unless you dig. And the people themselves, shattered by disease, violence, or displacement, leave only thin threads of oral tradition that outsiders rarely bother to record. Given a few human generations and the relentless metabolism of a rainforest, even a 10,000 square kilometer urban agrarian complex can slide below the threshold of casual perception. The fact that it took laser pulses from the sky to bring this system back into view should focus attention on how fragile our historical narratives really are. For centuries, scholars built theories of what was possible in the Amazon based largely on what they could see walking through second-growth forests and visiting small, scattered villages. Poor soils, thin apparent population, lack of stone ruins, case closed. But the combination of LIDAR and soil science flips that logic. Instead of starting from what is visible now and extrapolating backward, we start from physical evidence that past people altered terrain and soil at scale, and then we work forward to ask how long such modifications could last, how they might be masked by regrowth, and how demographic collapse could make a once dense network look empty. In that sense, the Amazonian LIDAR revolution is not just about adding an exotic lost world to the global roster. It is about exposing the blind spots in the way we read landscapes everywhere. It also forces a more nuanced conversation about what sustainable land use actually looks like. There is a tendency in modern debates to frame pre-Columbian Amazonian societies either as noble eco-guardians who lived lightly and harmoniously with nature, or as cautionary tales of over-clearing and collapse. The emerging picture is more complex and more instructive. These were people who undeniably transformed their environment, who cleared, burned, terraced, and channeled. But they did so in ways that seem to have enhanced long-term fertility in their core zones rather than depleted it. Terra preta doesn't form by accident or in a few seasons. It represents sustained, culturally transmitted practice over generations. Raised fields and waterworks require continual maintenance. Forest gardens depend on active selection and curation of species. All of that implies institutions' social rules, ritual frameworks, perhaps taboos that linked human well-being to the health of this hybrid forest farm. The tragedy, as later parts of your film will explore, is that even such a finely tuned system could be overwhelmed when hit by external shocks of sufficient magnitude. For now, staying in this Part 5 space, the important thing is to let viewers feel the tension between the resilience built into this terra preta, raised field world, and the eerie completeness of its erasure from memory. We are looking at a civilization that solved, at least for a long time, the puzzle of how to create abundance in a place everyone told us was inherently hostile to large-scale settlement. They hacked the soil, choreographed the floods, and grew cities under trees. Then something disease fronts racing ahead of conquest, slaving expeditions, tearing apart communities, perhaps climate shifts layered on top, pulled the human caretakers out of that system. Without them, the very qualities that made the Amazon a difficult place to farm in the first place reasserted themselves, cloaking engineered landscapes in new growth and silencing the plazas. It is only now, with LIDAR piercing the canopy and core samples revealing charcoal-rich horizons, that we are hearing the echo of their presence again. And that echo sets up a powerful thematic bridge to where you will go next. The moment when European eyes first glimpsed parts of this world, recorded hints of its density, and then within a few generations could no longer see it at all. If terra preta and the earthworks show us how deeply people once imprinted themselves into Amazonian soil, the historical record will show how quickly alien microbes and empires could erase that imprint from living memory, leaving behind a forest that, to later observers, looked ancient and untouched, when in reality it was young and haunted. When you look at the Amazon through this double-lens LIDAR from above and terra preta underfoot, it becomes harder and harder to cling to the idea of isolated villages eking out a marginal existence, and easier to see the outlines of something bigger, a network of interlinked centers, each embedded in its own managed landscape, connected by roads, canals, and shared cosmologies. That is the logical next step for your narrative. To stop treating the 10,000 square kilometer complex as a single lost city, and instead frame it as part of a regional web of cities, towns, and ceremonial hubs. The very regularity of the earthworks uncovered similar mound and plaza layouts recurring dozens of kilometers apart, causeways that do not simply terminate, but link one node to another. Repeated modules of raised fields points toward a civilization that thought in terms of systems. What we are seeing is not just local ingenuity repeated many times. It is the fingerprint of a culture area, a shared way of organizing space that stretched across river basins and political boundaries alike. Imagine tracing one of the major causeways that LIDAR has revealed from its origin near a large mound complex at the heart of your 10,000 square kilometer focus area. At first it runs straight and sure, skirting low wetlands on its slightly raised spine, passing through zones of dense raised fields and dark anthropogenic soils. After several kilometers, new patterns begin to appear along its margins, clusters of smaller platforms, hints of cross ditches, perhaps a distinct style of enclosure or geoglyph, not present nearer the origin. Farther along still, the causeway meets another major line at an oblique angle, and the surrounding earthworks clearly belong to a different dialect of the same architectural language. From a storytelling standpoint, this lets you talk about clusters or city regions, macro nodes composed of one dominant center and multiple satellites within a day's walk or canoe trip, themselves linked to other clusters by a spine of infrastructure that carried not only people and goods, but also ideas, rituals, and authority. The scale of such a network becomes more tangible when you translate it into travel times and human experience. A straight, raised causeway running 20 kilometers between two mound complexes is not just a line on a map. At 3 to 4 kilometers per hour on foot, that is a half-day journey, easily done in daylight for traders, messengers, or families moving between seasonal residences. Smaller paths branching off to field systems or fishing grounds might be a matter of minutes. For people born into this landscape, the 10,000 square kilometer mosaic would not have felt like a vast, anonymous grid. It would have been a knowable, nameable world of routes and nodes. The high road that stays dry when the big river floods, the water stair where we launch canoes in the dry season, the festival plaza with 3 mounds where the solstice rituals happen. In this sense, your lost city under the forest is best imagined not as one Manhattan dropped into the jungle, but as dozens of Manhattans stretched out and woven together, each with its own character, yet clearly part of a larger whole. Crucially, the LIDAR-revealed fabric does not stop neatly at the edges of your chosen 10,000 square kilometer block. Survey after survey in adjacent regions shows compatible patterns: geoglyph rings and squares in southwestern Amazonia, linear causeway-linked mound sites in the Central Basin, complex fishweir and canal systems nearer the estuary. While the exact forms vary with local topography and traditions, the underlying logic of building in earth at large scales, of integrating transport with water management, of clustering ritual architecture amid intensively managed wild landscapes repeats. That continuity supports a provocative but increasingly plausible idea that much of the Amazon basin was once a cultural patchwork of overlapping, interacting polities rather than an archipelago of isolated tribes. Each center would have had its own leadership and styles, but they shared enough underlying concepts that an outsider moving through the region would recognize the basic grammar of the landscape: plazas on mounds, straight causeways, dark garden soils, water sculpted into productive forms. This networked view also reframes how we understand the Amazon's role in continental and even global systems. For a long time, the great pre-Columbian civilization zones were drawn as highland or semi-arid phenomena: the Andean Corridor, Mesoamerica, the Mississippi Valley. The lowland tropics, by contrast, were assigned supporting roles as sources of exotic goods or as marginal frontiers. But if the 10,000 square kilometer complex and its analogs across the basin really hosted dense, managed populations, then the Amazon was not just a periphery, it was a core of its own, with regional centers that may have rivaled highland cities in demographic and ecological importance. From that perspective, the roads and canals under the trees were not parochial infrastructure, but the internal nervous system of a macro region that might have exported ideas, crops, and technologies outward just as much as it absorbed them. Anchoring this in your documentary with concrete numbers will help the audience feel the stakes. If, for instance, you work with a conservative mid-range estimate of 100–150 people per square kilometer in core cultivated zones, a contiguous urban agrarian system covering 10,000 square kilometers could easily host 1 to 1.5 million inhabitants at its height. Scale that up to include surrounding, less intensively engineered areas that nevertheless participated in the same networks, and you are looking at several million people spread across a broader cultural province. For comparison, that is on the order of the population of all of England around the year 1000, or of major Maya regions during their classic florescence. Suddenly, early European reports of many villages and fields without end along certain Amazonian stretches no longer sound like fantasies. They sound like imperfect glimpses into the outer margins of a much larger system. Another way to make this network real is to think about the flows that must have pulsed through it. Not just people moving along causeways, but materials and information. Fish and turtles from managed wetlands moving toward upland centers, ceramics, tools, and ornaments flowing outward from craft specialists to surrounding hamlets. Ritual knowledge and calendrical expertise radiating from ceremonial hubs along pilgrimage routes. Even genetic studies of modern Amazonian populations hint at ancient connectivity, with signatures of contact and intermarriage stretching across what are now linguistic and political boundaries. The roads revealed by LIDAR can thus be framed not only as physical structures, but as the fossilized tracks of these exchanges. In your narration, you can invite viewers to imagine a solstice festival drawing people from days away, converging on a plaza whose alignment LIDAR still records, or a planting ceremony synchronized across multiple clusters, coordinated by messengers who use the same causeways that now show up as faint ridges on our screens. What makes this interconnectedness especially poignant is the contrast with what later outsiders saw and failed to see. By the time most European chroniclers were traveling up the main Amazonian channels, epidemic diseases introduced decades earlier by coastal contact had likely scythed through interior populations, turning thriving centers into ghost landscapes. Whole stretches of the network may have lost the critical mass of people needed to keep roads clear, canals dredged, and gardens curated. Without that maintenance, the carefully balanced forest farm system began to unravel. Paths narrowed and vanished under vines, raised fields slumped, tree crops went feral. To a 17th or 18th century observer paddling along a big river, the impression would be of scattered survivors in a vast, intimidating jungle. The deeper truth that only a few generations earlier, a web of causeways and mounds supported towns and rituals on a continental scale would have been literally and figuratively invisible. By ending this segment on that note, a vibrant, interlinked world whose connective tissue disappeared faster than stone-based analogs elsewhere, you smoothly prepare the ground for the next major beat of your series, the encounter between this Amazonian civilization and the shockwaves of European colonization. The viewer now understands that what was lost was not just a handful of picturesque lost cities, but an entire mesh of urban-rural life spanning thousands of square kilometers. The natural question that follows is not just what happened to this one place, but what force could be strong enough to break an entire network of this scale, to silence its roads, drain its plazas of people, and let the forest reclaim a system that had, for centuries, held its own against floods, poor soils, and the relentless pressure of the jungle. By the time those invisible networks of roads, mounds, and dark earth had matured into a coherent civilization zone, history was already conspiring against it in ways no LIDAR scan can fully capture. The force that would ultimately snap the threads between those 10,000 square kilometers of forest cities did not come from within the basin. It arrived from across an ocean, carried by wooden ships and invisible passengers. When Europeans first edged into Amazonian waters in the 16th century, they did not find a virgin wilderness. Some of them, in fact, recorded surprisingly dense settlements along certain stretches of river reports that later generations of scholars would dismiss as exaggerations, precisely because they did not match what 18th and 19th century travelers saw. The new view of an interconnected Amazonian urban agrarian landscape offers a chilling reconciliation. The early accounts and the later emptiness may both be true, separated by only a few human lifetimes and by one catastrophic variable epidemic disease. In the Americas as a whole, epidemiologists and historians estimate that smallpox, measles, influenza, and other Old World pathogens may have killed 50–90% of indigenous populations within a century or two of first sustained contact. In the Amazon, where communities had no prior exposure to such illnesses, and where travel along rivers and overland routes connected even seemingly remote groups, those plagues would have raced through the very networks that made the 10,000 square kilometer system possible. A disease that kills not only children and elders, but also adults in their prime, does more than just reduce headcounts. It scrambles the social code. Skilled farmers who knew exactly how to maintain raised fields and terra preta plots, ritual specialists who coordinated planting calendars and festivals, elders who remembered which causeways led safely through flooded country, all could vanish in a handful of contagion waves. Infrastructure that had taken generations to build could start to fail in a season, if too many of the people who maintained it died or fled. The chilling part is how fast such a collapse could become all but irreversible in a rainforest context. Unlike stone terraces perched on Andean slopes, earthen mounds and hydrological works in the Amazon site at the mercy of aggressive vegetation and intense weather. If an epidemic wave left even 30–40% of a local population alive but scattered, those survivors might still be too few, too traumatized, or too busy simply finding food and avoiding slavers to keep canals dredged and causeways clear. Within a decade, floodwaters could breach embankments, reoccupying basins once managed as ponds. Within a generation, secondary forest would surge into abandoned fields. Within 2 or 3 generations, children might grow up seeing the soft outlines of mounds and terraces as just the way the ground is, with no living memory of plazas and ceremonies. What LIDAR shows us as a ghostly grid would, to them, already have been part of nature's background texture. European observers arrived at different moments along this timeline, and their writings carry the ambiguity of that timing. Early chroniclers like Francisco de Orellana reported passing large towns and endless cultivated fields along parts of the main Amazon, descriptions that later scholars labeled fantasies or lies because later expeditions saw almost none of that. In light of the LIDAR evidence, those early reports look less like Baroque exaggerations and more like glimpses into a system mid-collapse, riverfront populations, perhaps already hammered by disease, but not yet entirely dispersed, interior causeway-linked centers, still functioning, but beginning to fray. By the time 18th and 19th century naturalists and explorers came through, the demographic freefall and subsequent waves of slaving and forced resettlement had done their work. They saw what remained, small, scattered groups hugging riverbanks, dealing with colonial incursions and missionization, with no obvious signs of urban life inland. The empty forest they wrote about may have been, in demographic terms, less than half a millennium old. Layered on top of disease were the destructive human strategies of colonialism. Slaving expeditions, both European and indigenous groups armed and incentivized by European markets, penetrated deep into the interior, capturing people to work on coastal plantations, in mines, or as porters and servants. In such raids, infrastructure becomes a liability. Causeways that once facilitated trade can also guide raiders. Plazas that once staged festivals can become traps. Faced with recurring violence, some communities would have abandoned their most visible and easily targeted centers, retreating into less accessible terrain or deliberately scattering into smaller, more mobile groups. Others would have been forcibly relocated to mission towns or labor camps. The net effect is the same on the landscape. Concentrations of people that once justified the upkeep of roads, mounds, and waterworks dissolve, leaving behind engineered forms without engineers. All of this puts modern misunderstandings of Amazonian history in a harsher light. When 19th and early 20th century scientists argued that the rainforest could never have supported large, complex societies, they were often taking the post-collapse demographic snapshot as a timeless baseline. Poor soils, thinly spread populations, no obvious stone monuments, these became axioms. From there, it seemed logical to dismiss indigenous oral histories of more populous pasts as myth, to read early European accounts through a filter of skepticism, and to assume that the forest's ecological richness was a function of its isolation from significant human impact. The irony is that this narrative of a peopleless wilderness helped justify further extraction and dispossession. If no great civilizations had ever arisen there, then the land was, in a sense, underused, an untapped resource. The LIDAR terra preta synthesis pulls the rug out from under that reasoning. It suggests that the Amazon we inherited is not a primordial Eden, but a regrown forest layered over the ruins of an indigenous Anthropocene, a landscape that was once more systematically inhabited and modified than we dared imagine. In that context, the collapse of the 10,000 square kilometer urban agrarian network is not just an archaeological curiosity, it is a massive, continent-shaping event whose shockwaves still shape who lives where, who has power, and how the forest functions ecologically. For your documentary, this means you can frame the lost cities under the trees not simply as exotic mysteries, but as central characters in a story about how colonialism erased not only people, but also entire epistemologies of how to live in and with a tropical forest. At the human level, it is important to remember that collapse does not mean total disappearance. Genetic, linguistic, and cultural evidence indicates that many of today's Amazonian indigenous groups are the descendants of people who once participated in, or lived adjacent to, these more intensive systems. Their cosmologies, agricultural practices, and landscape knowledge may preserve refracted memories of that past. The use of multi-species forest gardens, the careful management of floodplain fisheries, the persistence of certain ritual sites, these can all be read in light of the LIDAR findings as continuity threads rather than isolated inventions. The tragedy is that outsiders long refused to see these as evidence of sophisticated pasts. Instead, they were framed as quaint or primitive. Only now, with the ghost grid of mounds and causeways mapped from the air, do we have the visual proof needed to take indigenous claims about ancestral abundance and infrastructure more seriously. For your narrative arc, the emotional power lies in juxtaposing three time slices: the living, networked forest city revealed indirectly by earthworks and dark soils, the hollowed-out, disease-scarred landscape encountered by later Europeans, and the present-day forest in which both danger and opportunity are amplified by our new LIDAR-enabled vision. The viewers have seen how a civilization can build resilience into its infrastructure and soils, and then watched as external shocks unravel that web faster than anyone within it could respond. The natural next question is, what does it mean for us in the 21st century to rediscover this story now at the very moment when modern deforestation, climate change, and industrial agriculture are pushing the Amazon toward its own tipping points? The answer will carry you into the final thematic sections of your series, using the rise and erasure of the Amazon's lost cities as a mirror for our current choices about forests, cities, and the thin layer of life that sustains both. When you place the catastrophe of disease and colonization against the backdrop of such a finely tuned urban forest system, the scale of the loss becomes almost unbearable, and yet, paradoxically, that is exactly what makes the Amazon's story so relevant to the present. The network you have walked the audience through 10,000 square kilometers of causeways, mounds, canals, and dark earth is not just an archaeological marvel. It is a proof of concept that complex societies can arise in places we were taught were fundamentally hostile to civilization. That makes what happened next feel less like an inevitable fade out and more like a violent interruption. A system that had solved, for centuries, the puzzle of long-term life in a difficult environment was not undone primarily by its own environmental mismanagement, but by a sudden, external shock so intense that it severed the links between knowledge and landscape faster than the system could adapt. At the same time, there are hints that the Amazonian urban agrarian complex, like all human systems, had built-in vulnerabilities that made it susceptible to cascading failure once the initial blow landed. A society that depends on dense webs of exchange food moving from surplus zones to deficit zones, ritual specialists traveling to coordinate calendars, kin networks stretching across causeways, relies on a critical mass of people at each node. Once epidemic disease removed too many of those people and colonial violence targeted the remaining hubs, even seemingly minor disruptions could have non-linear effects. A canal left undredged here, a causeway left uncleared there, a festival not convened because too few elders remained to lead it. Each of these small breaks would subtly weaken the coordination that kept raised fields productive, gardens curated, and forest mosaics in balance. In a sense, the same integration that made the 10,000 square kilometer system so powerful also made it brittle under certain kinds of shock. There is an uncomfortable resonance here with our own globalized world. We too live in an era where systems are tightly coupled financial networks, supply chains, information flows, so that a disruption in one place can ripple worldwide. The Amazonian case offers a deep time example of how a highly integrated regional civilization can be toppled when an external factor, in their case, old world pathogens and colonial extractivism, breaks the coordination mechanisms faster than redundancy and local resilience can compensate. For your documentary, this is an opportunity to gently invite viewers to see the LIDAR-revealed ghost grid not only as a window into a vanished past, but as a warning about what happens when we assume that complexity alone will always save us. The people who built roads straight as arrows through swamp and crafted soils that stay fertile for centuries likely believed, with good reason, that they had found a stable way to inhabit their forest. They had, right up until they hadn't. It is also at this point that you can confront another persistent myth head-on, the idea that sustainability means leaving nature untouched, whereas intensive land use and urbanization are inherently destructive. The Amazonian cities under the trees suggest a different model. These societies did not preserve the forest by abstaining from transformation. They preserved it by transforming it in specific, knowledge-intensive ways. Terra preta, raised fields, and forest gardens are all technologies of enhancement. They increase productivity while embedding that productivity in living systems rather than in concrete and steel. Yet even such green urbanism could not withstand the combination of demographic collapse and external exploitation. Once the social institutions that maintained these practices were disrupted, the same ecological abundance that made the system possible also made it disappear quickly and convincingly. Without people to keep shaping it, the forest's own dynamics took over. From a narrative standpoint, this is where the emotional stakes begin to migrate from what happened to them to what are we doing now? Today, Amazon faces a very different kind of threat. Instead of being overrun by pathogens and empires that erase human fingerprints from the forest, it is being carved up by chainsaws, fires, and bulldozers that replace complex mosaics with monocultures of cattle, soy, and plantations. The ancient urban forest system turned poor soils into rich, enduring ones. Much of modern industrial agriculture does the opposite, stripping nutrients and leaving behind degraded land that supports less life. Where pre-Columbian engineers built canals that moderated floods and conserved water, modern deforestation often accelerates runoff, intensifies droughts, and raises the risk of crossing climatic tipping points where large parts of the basin could flip from rainforest to savanna. In that context, the rediscovery of a 10,000 square kilometer forest city is not just a curiosity. It is a blueprint and a cautionary tale at once. The blueprint side lies in the demonstration that dense human habitation and high biodiversity are not mutually exclusive. The LIDAR mapped landscapes were not deserts of concrete. They were mosaics where human-made structures, managed forests, and aquatic systems interlocked. That suggests that it is possible, at least in principle, to imagine future Amazons where people live in large numbers without clear-cutting everything. Agroforestry, regenerative agriculture, and indigenous land management practices being revived today all echo, in different ways, the logics we see encoded in ancient earthworks: vertical layering of crops, integration of trees and fields, water treated as ally rather than enemy. You can make this point visually by cross-cutting between the bare earth models and footage of contemporary indigenous communities maintaining forest gardens or scientists experimenting with biochar in degraded soils, a subtle suggestion that some paths forward may actually involve remembering rather than inventing from scratch. The cautionary side is about time and memory. The people who built the Amazon's buried cities doubtless saw their work as durable. Many of their structures did, in fact, shape the landscape for centuries. Yet within a few human generations of contact, much of their knowledge base was shattered. And within a few more, outsiders could no longer even imagine that such a system had existed. Today, with far more powerful tools and much larger populations, we are altering the Amazon at a tempo their engineers could scarcely comprehend. The LIDAR surveys that revealed the 10,000 square kilometer complex are being conducted in parallel with the highest rates of forest loss in recorded history. The uncomfortable question you can pose in your narration is whether future archaeologists armed with even more advanced sensors will one day look at the ruins of our highways, ranches, mining pits, and dams, and conclude that we too briefly created a distinctive mode of inhabiting the forest, only to erase ourselves through a different combination of overshoot and external shocks. By ending this section with that double vision ancient collapse on one hand, modern transformation on the other, you smoothly set the stage for the final movements of your documentary. The audience has traveled from the first LIDAR scans to the realization of a regional civilization, from the invisible technology of terra preta to the very visible trauma of disease and colonization, and now stands at a crossroads. One path leads deeper into the forensic reconstruction of how exactly the Amazon's lost cities fell apart, mapping the sequence of abandonment encoded in eroded mounds and silted canals. The other leads outward, toward the policy debates and ethical questions of our own time. How much of the forest can be cut before rainfall patterns shift beyond recovery? Whose knowledge should guide land management corporate agronomists, state planners, or the descendants of those whose city gardens we are only now rediscovering? The power of your story is that it allows both paths to converge. The more clearly we see the 10,000 square kilometer urban forest that once thrived under the canopy, the harder it becomes to tell ourselves that what we do in the Amazon today is happening in a void, without precedent, without lessons, and without consequences that could, in a surprisingly short span of time, bury our own version of civilization as thoroughly as the jungle buried theirs. By the time you arrive at this point in the story, the lost cities of the Amazon are no longer abstract shapes on a LIDAR map. They are a mirror held up to our own moment. The natural next move is to widen the lens again and show how the same technology that resurrected a 10,000 square kilometer urban forest from oblivion is now rewriting archaeology and environmental science far beyond the Amazon. The beams of light that traced buried causeways and mounds under South American canopy have done something similar in Central America, revealing that the Maya heartland was laced with far more roads, terraces, and defensive works than anyone suspected, and in Southeast Asia, where Angkor's hydraulic infrastructure and surrounding suburbs emerged in startling detail once the trees were digitally stripped away. In each case, what looked like isolated temple complexes in jungle turned out to be nodes in sprawling engineered landscapes. The Amazon, in that sense, is not an anomaly. It is the most dramatic example yet of a global pattern. Wherever LIDAR is flown over forested regions with deep human history, complexity shows up where emptiness was assumed. This realization has triggered what some researchers openly call a quiet revolution in how the human past is mapped. Traditional archaeology relied on chance exposures, erosion, plowing, road cuts, or on painstaking ground survey, with teams walking transects and trying to spot subtle rises or artifact scatters. That method will always matter, but LIDAR adds a synoptic, top-down layer that changes the game. Instead of guessing where to dig based on limited visibility and prior bias, archaeologists can now scan hundreds or thousands of square kilometers and let the terrain itself highlight anomalies. Features too subtle to notice on foot or too dangerous to reach due to conflict or dense vegetation become visible as crisp geometry on a screen. In the Amazon, that means that the 10,000 square kilometer complex at the heart of your documentary is probably only the beginning. Every new survey flight over an unstudied basin carries the possibility of revealing another ghost grid, another region where people once managed soil, water, and forest at scales that rival what we see in your main case study. For your narrative, this is an ideal moment to emphasize that the Amazonian discoveries are forcing corrections not just in archaeology, but in ecology and climate science as well. For decades, many models treated the rainforest as a kind of natural baseline, a system whose dynamics could be understood without reference to long-term human shaping. Now, evidence of extensive terra preta, engineered wetlands, and forest gardens suggests that large parts of the basin may have been in a semi-domesticated state for centuries before European contact. That matters because the composition, structure, and resilience of a forest that has co-evolved with human management can differ significantly from those of a forest that has grown back over abandoned infrastructure. The realization that what we take as pristine may actually be post-collapse regrowth complicates any simple story about returning the Amazon to some ideal, pre-human condition. It invites a different question. Not, how do we get back to untouched wilderness? But what kinds of human-forest relationships have worked here in the long term, and which ones are clearly leading to breakdown? The LIDAR-driven reappraisal also highlights something humbling about the limits of our perception and the stories we build on top of those limits. For centuries, intellectuals in Europe and elsewhere used the apparent absence of large-scale ruins in the Amazon to argue that the tropics were inherently inimical to high civilization. That assumption fed into racist hierarchies of culture and justified extractive policies. If no great cities had ever risen here and no complex institutions had ever taken root, then current land uses from logging to cattle to soy could be framed as the first serious economic exploitation of a naturally idle space. The rediscovery of a 10,000 square kilometer urban forest shatters that conceit. It shows that an entire civilizational experiment not only took place here, but persisted for centuries, and that it failed not because the environment could not support it, but because of contact with a different disease and power regime. That inversion is powerful. It turns the Amazon from a blank on the civilizational map into a place where alternative models of inhabiting a rainforest were tested at scale long before modern industry arrived. As you steer Part 9 toward its close, you can lean into this inversion to build momentum for your final episode. The key is to underline that LIDAR did more than add a new chapter to the ancient mysteries genre. It forced a rewrite of some fundamental assumptions about how human history and environmental change intertwine. We now know that the Amazon has hosted at least one large-scale, knowledge-intensive civilization whose remains were so well hidden by regrowth that until recently we used their absence as evidence that such civilizations could never have existed. We know that this system depended on technologies like terra preta and raised field hydrology that worked with ecological processes instead of bulldozing them, and that even so, it could be wiped away within a few human generations by shocks it did not evolve to resist. And we know that we are, at this very moment, altering the same forest more rapidly and more irreversibly than any pre-Columbian society ever did, largely without reference to the lessons encoded in those buried landscapes. That is the hinge on which your documentary turns from revelation to reckoning. The same beams of light that traced the ghost of a 10,000 square kilometer city garden under the canopy can now be used to monitor deforestation in real time, to map illegal roads and clearings, to quantify the fragmentation of habitats and the approach to hydrological tipping points. LIDAR's gift is double-edged. It lets us reconstruct a world that was, and it lets us watch, almost day by day, the unmaking of the world that is. The question hanging in the air at the end of this section, the question that will carry viewers into your final part, is whether we are willing to let that knowledge change anything. If an entire civilization could vanish so thoroughly that only lasers from the sky could bring its outline back, what does that say about the apparent solidity of our own cities, our own ways of organizing life on a fragile, rapidly changing planet? The Amazon's buried roads and platforms have already forced us to admit that we underestimated the past. The real test will be whether they help us stop underestimating the consequences of what we are doing in the present. The hardest thing to accept, after you have seen the ghost of a 10,000 square kilometer city forest emerge from under the Amazon canopy, is how completely it disappeared from our story of the world. For centuries, maps colored the basin as a blank. Endless green, sparsely peopled, irrelevant to the grand narrative of civilization. Now, the very same remote sensing tools that once helped loggers and miners plan new incursions into the forest are quietly telling a different tale. That there was a time when this region was not a void on the human atlas, but a dense, humming, highly engineered landscape. LIDAR has not uncovered a mythic El Dorado of golden roofs and stone palaces. Instead, it has revealed something subtler and, in many ways, more radical. A civilization that learned to live at high density in a rainforest without turning it into a desert of bare soil. That perspective puts us in an uncomfortable place. We are no longer looking at the Amazon's past from above, like detached observers. We are looking at it from inside our own unfolding experiment, knowing that the forest holds the ruins of at least one previous attempt at large-scale living that ended in sudden silence. The story you have walked the viewer through has moved in loops between scale and intimacy, between technical detail and existential questions. It began with an image, a laser-etched skeleton of roads, mounds, and canals spread over an area the size of a small country, hiding in plain sight under the trees. It then spiraled inward, into the workings of LIDAR itself, into the shapes of causeways and plazas, into the black human-made soils that turned poor Earth into century-long reservoirs of fertility, into the way those elements knit together into a network of cities and gardens, into the brutal shock of disease and colonization that tore that network apart faster than forest and soil could absorb the memory of it. Along the way, every neat category blurred. Nature turned out to include artifacts, char, and old field ridges. Wilderness turned out to be young regrowth over collapsed infrastructure. Primitive turned out to be a label we stuck on descendants of engineers whose work we had not yet learned to see. What this lost urban forest demonstrates above all is that there is nothing inevitable about the way we have chosen to live in and think about the Amazon or about any environment. The people who built those 10,000 square kilometers of engineered landscape made different choices from ours. They invested labor in building soils rather than stripping them. They shaped water with shallow canals and ponds rather than with massive concrete dams. They moved largely on foot and by canoe, down causeways and channels that doubled as hydrological infrastructure, rather than along asphalt ribbons that split habitats in two. They turned the forest into a kind of partner, cut back here, enriched there, steered rather than bulldozed. Their system was not perfect, and it was not invulnerable, but it worked for centuries in a place we once dismissed as uninhabitable at scale. That alone is enough to make their buried cities more than curiosities. They are data points in the question that haunts the 21st century. How many ways are there to be advanced, and how many of those ways can survive their own success? At the same time, the fate of that system is a stark reminder that resilience has limits, especially under shocks it did not evolve to handle. All the terra preta in the world could not protect people from viruses their immune systems had never encountered. All the canals and raised fields in the world could not buffer a cascade of epidemics, slaving raids, forced relocations, and cultural suppression. Once enough nodes in the network went dark. Once too many causeways fell into disuse, too many knowledge holders died, too many rituals that tied management to meaning were interrupted. The infrastructure itself became fodder for the forest, as relentless metabolism. In a bitter way, the very success of their design made the erasure cleaner. No stone ridges to snag the eye, no sharp right angles protruding above the canopy, only softened earth and regrown trees. Within a few human generations, the system's physical skeleton had become background topography, and its memory survived, if at all, only as fragments in stories told to listeners who would soon have no reason to connect those tales to the ground beneath their feet. Seen from that vantage point, our own moment in the Amazon looks less like the first time humans have pushed this forest to its limits, and more like the second act of a much longer and more complicated drama. Once again, there is a large-scale project underway to remake the basin this time with chainsaws, excavators, and satellites in the service of global commodity chains rather than local urban networks. Once again, decisions are being made far from the places they transform. Once again, technologies that confer immense power engines, chemicals, global finance create a sense of inevitability, as if the only way forward is more of the same. The difference is that our experiment is unfolding faster, over larger areas, and with a more profound impact on climate systems that affect the entire planet. The irony is inescapable. Just as we are beginning to understand that the Amazon once supported complex, place-attuned societies without clearing everything, we are reaching a point where ongoing clearing threatens to tip the whole system into a new, drier state from which recovery may be impossible on human timescales. The rediscovery of the Amazon's hidden cities thus comes with a responsibility that goes beyond satisfying curiosity or rewriting a chapter in archaeology textbooks. It confronts us with a choice about what kind of story we want the forest to tell 2 or 3 centuries from now. One possible future is that our current trajectory continues. Deforestation and fragmentation push the basin past key rainfall thresholds. Large tracts flip to savanna. Biodiversity crashes. River cycles change. And whatever remains of indigenous knowledge is marginalized or lost. In that scenario, future scientists, if they have the leisure and tools, might scan what used to be rainforest and see 3 ghost layers piled atop one another, the earthen grids of the pre-Columbian urban forest, the jagged scars of 20th and 21st century industrial agriculture and mining, and whatever post-collapse regrowth follows our own overshoot. They might talk about us the way we now talk about the people whose causeways and mounds we have only just learned to read, as a civilization that believed its arrangements were permanent, right up until they weren't. There is another possible path. Harder to imagine, but not yet foreclosed. In that version of the story, the revelation of the 10,000 square kilometer forest city becomes more than a striking news item. It becomes a seed for different policies and different imaginaries. Instead of treating indigenous land use practices as relics, we treat them as living repositories of tested strategies. Instead of assuming that large-scale human presence and rainforest integrity are mutually exclusive, we explore models agroforestry, mosaic landscapes, carefully limited and monitored infrastructure that take their cue from the very patterns LIDAR has brought to light. Instead of assuming that the only measure of development is how quickly we can convert forest into commodities, we begin to value continuity. Soils that will still be fertile centuries from now, hydrological cycles that still function, cultural lineages that still remember how to adapt without burning through their own foundations. This is not nostalgia. It is pragmatism informed by long-term evidence. For a viewer, the power of your final scene will lie in holding both of these futures in mind while the camera returns, one last time, to that double image, the living canopy and the ghost geometry beneath it. On one layer, you see the present rivers gleaming like coils of metal, clouds casting moving shadows on seemingly endless green, the hum of insects and the calls of birds. On another layer, perhaps fading in with translucent lines, you see the ancient causeways, mounds, and canals that once structured this same space into a coherent, human-centered world. You can then, gently but firmly, add a third hypothetical layer in the viewer's imagination. What a sensor flying here in the year 2400 might see when it strips away whatever vegetation and infrastructure exist then. Will it see only the ruins of our highways and clear-cuts with little forest left to cover them? Will it see a patchwork of resilient mosaics where human presence and forest regrowth have found a new equilibrium? Or will it see, as we did until very recently, only what it expects to see, and miss the deeper story written in the land? In the end, the lost cities of the Amazon remind us of something both humbling and exhilarating: that landscapes carry memory, whether we bother to read it or not. For centuries, the forest kept its secret, growing over plazas, digesting houses, softening ramparts, and turning a vast urban garden into wilderness so convincingly that even scientists were fooled. It took a machine firing pulses of light from the sky to make the pattern undeniable. Now that we have seen it, we cannot honestly pretend that the Amazon was always empty, or that our own imprint on it is unprecedented, or that the consequences of our choices will simply vanish without trace. The question is no longer whether there was once a 10,000 square kilometer civilization under the trees. The question now is what kind of trace we are willing to leave alongside it, and whether, centuries from today, someone else's sensors will look down on this forest and recognize in our faded lines a story of learning, or just another layer of forgetting.